When John Parker bought his dream home, he envisioned peaceful mornings with his son in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the chaos of city life. Little did he know, his dream would soon turn into a battle for his rights against an unchecked authority. Karen, the head of the local homeowners association, showed up uninvited one morning, armed with nothing but a clipboard and a demand for inspections that John never agreed to. What follows is a tense, relentless struggle that tests John's resolve to protect his home and his family from an oppressive system. This gripping story raises questions about authority, control, and the lengths individuals will go to impose their will on others. What would you do if you were in John's shoes? Would you stand up for your rights, even when it means confronting the very system meant to protect you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear from you. Stay tuned and watch till the end to discover the unexpected twists in John's fight for justice. This is a story of triumph, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of tyranny. You won't want to miss it. You've worked your whole life to buy the home of your dreams. Finally, a place where you can relax, escape the chaos, and raise your child in peace. It's a perfect home, spacious with a big backyard for your child to play in, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood far away from the noise of the city. Everything feels right. But what happens when someone steps into your life? Someone who believes they have the power to control every aspect of it. Someone who thinks they can dictate the rules of your own home? This is the harsh reality for John Parker, a father who thought he had finally found his sanctuary. His dream home quickly becomes a battleground when Karen, the head of the local homeowners association, knocks on his door one Saturday morning. Armed with nothing but a clipboard and a demand to inspect his property, Karen insists that John is now under the HOA's control. The problem? John never agreed to any of this. He never signed up for the HOA, and in fact, he's never even heard of it. What follows is a relentless struggle for John to protect his family and his peace against an individual who believes her authority is unquestionable. John's fight isn't just for his home, it's for his right to live free from someone else's idea of control. Get ready. This is a battle you won't want to miss. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden light over the quiet neighborhood. John Parker sat on his porch, savoring the rare moment of peace with a cup of coffee in hand. The fresh scent of cut grass lingered in the air from a neighbor's early landscaping, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could truly breathe. His son, Liam, was still asleep inside after a late-night movie marathon. But then, the peace was shattered. A loud, aggressive pounding on the front door made John spill coffee onto his shirt. He shot to his feet, heart racing, thinking someone might be trying to break into his home. His hand flew to the door handle, but before he could open it, a sharp, demanding voice rang out. "Open up! Homeowners Association inspection!" Confusion flooded John's mind. He'd never signed anything related to an HOA when he bought the house. The entire neighborhood seemed too quiet, too small for such an organization. What? Homeowners Association? John muttered under his breath, unlocking the door. The woman standing there was in her mid-50s, dressed sharply, her arms crossed in a stance that screamed authority. Her short, heavily styled blonde hair barely moved as she spoke with an air of entitlement that John had only seen in stories online. "Can I help you?" John asked, keeping his voice steady, but already feeling a headache brewing. The woman sized him up, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to assess whether he was worth her time. "You must be new. I'm Karen, head of the Homeowners Association board here," she said, a smug smile curling her lips. "We're conducting inspections today to ensure your property complies with HOA regulations. It's all part of the rules here. You'll need to let me in." John blinked, still not quite understanding. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that applies to me. I didn't sign up for any homeowners association. I bought this house outright, and there was no mention of it during the purchase." Karen's face darkened instantly, her smugness slipping into irritation. "That's incorrect," she snapped, her voice sharp and cold. "Every home in this neighborhood is subject to the Homeowners Association regulations. Maybe your realtor forgot to mention it, but I run things here, and everyone follows the rules, whether they like it or not. Now, If you'll just step aside, I'll do a quick walkthrough." John stood his ground, not moving a single inch. "No," he said firmly, his hand pressing against the doorframe. "You're not coming in." Karen's eyes flashed with surprise, her mouth falling open slightly as she tried to regain her composure. "Excuse me?" Her voice was raised now, incredulous. "You have to comply. It's in the community guidelines. Your lawn, the exterior paint, your fence, everything needs to meet HOA standards, and I have the authority to inspect it." John let out a long breath, keeping his calm despite the mounting frustration. "Like I said, I don't have an HOA. I went through all the paperwork before moving in. This house was never under any HOA jurisdiction." Karen stepped closer, now towering in front of him with an air of superiority. "That's where you're wrong. We recently annexed several homes into the HOA, and yours is one of them. As a new member, you're already in violation of several guidelines." She waved the clipboard in front of him, as though it somehow validated her authority. "For one, your driveway has that unsightly truck parked right there. We don't allow such vehicles to be visible from the street, and I can already see your grass isn't the right length. That's a fine." John let out a bitter laugh, not believing what he was hearing. "A fine for my truck and my grass?" Karen lifted her chin in response, her voice dripping with arrogance. "That's right. And if you refuse to comply, there will be more penalties. Now, are you going to step aside, or is there going to be a problem?" The tension in the air was thick, but John took another deep breath, pushing down the anger that was rising in him. "Lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I own this house. You have no right to come in here. If you really think I'm part of your HOA, then show me the legal paperwork." Karen hesitated for a brief moment, her smug expression faltering before she regained her composure. "I'll be sending you a welcome packet with all the necessary documents," she said, her tone still condescending. "But I strongly suggest you don't make an enemy out of me. It would be very unfortunate to start off on the wrong foot with the Homeowners Association." John's eyes narrowed. "What exactly does that mean?" Karen smiled coldly, her voice lowering. "It means I have the power to enforce fines, restrictions, and if necessary, foreclosure. You'll soon learn that I'm in charge here." That was the breaking point for John. Without another word, he slammed the door in her face. He could hear her muttering angrily outside, but he didn't care. As he watched through the peephole, he saw her storm off, her heels clicking on the pavement with authority. John ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. He had heard the horror stories about Homeowners Association abuse before, but he never thought he'd be dealing with it firsthand. And worse, this woman wasn't just some annoying neighbor. She genuinely believed she had control over his home. His son, Liam, walked up behind him, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Dad, who was that?" John sighed, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Just a nosy neighbor, buddy. Nothing to worry about." But deep down, he knew that this wasn't the last time he'd see Karen. As John turned away from the door, he tried to push the irritation out of his mind. Today was supposed to be a day of relaxation, a chance to enjoy his new home. He made breakfast for Liam and tried to put the incident behind him. But in the pit of his stomach, he had a feeling this wasn't over. The day passed uneventfully, or so John hoped. He spent the morning mowing the lawn, not because of Karen's ridiculous comments, but because it needed to be done. He made small repairs inside the house, then took a moment to relax with a cold drink on the porch while Liam played in the backyard. The peaceful atmosphere, although slightly marred by the earlier encounter, was enough to help John unwind. But the calm didn't last long. Just as he was about to take a breath and enjoy a bit of silence, the unsettling sound of a vehicle pulling up in his driveway pierced the air. John's heart sank. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation, but he already knew deep down that it was coming. "Dad, who's that?" Liam called out, looking up from his game. "I don't know, buddy. Stay inside, okay?" John said, his voice steady but a knot tightening in his stomach. He opened the door slowly, and peeking out through the small crack. And there she was, Karen, standing next to a man who looked as though he were uncomfortable in his own skin. He was balding, wearing a poorly fitted polo shirt, and holding a clipboard just like hers. John immediately recognized the man, Tom, the so-called treasurer of the Homeowners Association, someone he had never met but had certainly heard of now. And beside them, there was a wheelbarrow filled with bright, glaring HOA signs that made John's blood run cold. The sight felt like an invasion, an attempt to mark his property as theirs. Karen was standing confidently, clipboard raised as if she was issuing a command. Tom, on the other hand, looked almost like a man forced into a situation he wasn't sure how to handle. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" John demanded, stepping onto the porch, his voice rising in frustration. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced at him dismissively, turning back to Tom as if John wasn't even there. "Just measuring your driveway," she said matter-of-factly, crouching down and pulling out a measuring tape. "It appears to extend past Homeowners Association limits. Another violation I'll have to report." The audacity. John clenched his fist, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered under his breath, stepping down the porch steps toward them. "I already told you, I'm not part of your HOA. You're trespassing." Tom cleared his throat nervously, glancing at Karen for reassurance before speaking. "This is a formal warning," he said in a nasal voice, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "You have until next week to correct your violations." The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. John felt his patience snapping. "I've had enough," he said, his tone icy. "Both of you need to leave now, or I'm calling the cops." Karen didn't seem rattled in the least. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and smiled condescendingly. "Go ahead, call them. Let's see what they think about your unauthorized property modifications," she said, daring him with her words. And that was the last straw for John. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need officers sent to my address immediately," he said calmly. "I have 2 people trespassing on my property and refusing to leave. One of them is trying to enforce fake Homeowners Association rules on a house that isn't even part of their jurisdiction." He could hear the disbelief in Karen's voice as she sputtered, trying to regain control. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed, but John didn't care. The dispatcher answered, asking for details. John gave the information, making sure to stay calm despite his rising anger. "Yes, I need them removed now. I don't know what they think they're doing, but they are trespassing, and I want them gone." As he hung up, he could hear Karen muttering insults under her breath, but he wasn't paying attention anymore. John crossed his arms and leaned against the door frame, his gaze locked on the 2 intruders. He knew this wouldn't be over easily, but he wasn't about to back down. It didn't take long before he heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows as the police cruisers pulled up in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, one tall with a stern expression and the other a woman with short brown hair, surveying the situation. Karen, spotting the officers, straightened up as though she had somehow summoned them with her presence. She pointed an accusing finger at John, her voice high-pitched as she shrieked, "There, that man! He's trespassing on my property and threatened me." The officers didn't move at first, their eyes shifting between Karen and John. They seemed to be taking everything in, weighing the situation before making a decision. One of the officers, a man with sharp eyes, crouched down to Liam, who had come to the door with his father. "Hey, buddy, you all right?" he asked softly, his voice calm. Liam nodded hesitantly, gripping John's pant leg. The child was clearly scared, and John could feel his anger burn brighter at the sight of it. His voice shook with restrained fury. "I called the police. She hit my son. I want to press charges." Karen let out a forced, hollow laugh. "Oh, please, I barely touched him. He was running around where he shouldn't have been. I was teaching him some manners." She tried to justify her actions, but the desperation in her voice was obvious. The female officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Do you have proof that this property belongs to you?" she asked Karen, her tone skeptical. Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Well, not exactly," she stammered, "but—" Before she could continue, John stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "I have proof," he said calmly, swiping through the images of his purchase documents. He held the screen up, showing the legal paperwork, with his name clearly printed on it. Karen's face drained of color as she saw the proof. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flickered with anger. "That doesn't mean anything," she spat. "There are laws about homeowners association regulations. He has to comply." But the officer was already shaking her head. "What it does mean, ma'am," she interrupted, "is that John is the legal homeowner. Unless you can provide evidence stating otherwise, I suggest you stop making claims that aren't backed up by facts." Karen was at a loss for words. The female officer turned back to John. "Sir, we'll need your statement, but it looks like we have a solid case here. We'll handle this from here." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered around murmured, some of them filming the interaction on their phones, others offering quiet support to John. They'd seen enough, and now it was time for Karen's power trip to come to an end. John felt a small measure of relief as the officers prepared to take Karen away. As she was led to the squad car, she glared at him, her voice trembling with rage. "You've ruined everything. You'll regret this." John stood firm, looking down at Liam, who was still clinging to his side. "No, Karen," he muttered, his voice low but certain. "You did this to yourself." And as the police car drove away with Karen inside, John finally allowed himself to breathe. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was a victory, a step toward the peace he had been fighting for. And for the first time since moving in, he felt like he could truly relax in his own home. The next morning, John barely had time to finish his coffee when another knock echoed from the front door. His stomach twisted into a knot. He had hoped that Karen's arrest, along with the police's involvement, would be the final blow to her relentless harassment. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. He stood up and motioned for Liam to stay inside. "Stay here, buddy. I'll handle this." With a sigh, he walked toward the door and opened it cautiously, already bracing himself for another round. Standing there, nervously shifting from foot to foot, was Tom, the man who had been with Karen the previous day. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a thick envelope, which he shoved into John's hands without a word. "What's this?" John asked, narrowing his eyes at the envelope. "A formal notice," Tom stammered, adjusting his glasses as he looked everywhere but at John. "From the Homeowners Association, you've been fined for multiple violations, and you have 72 hours to comply before further action is taken." John ripped the envelope open, his heart sinking as he read the list of supposed violations written in bold, ridiculous terms. Unauthorized vehicle parked in driveway, grass height exceeding HOA standards, and even unapproved exterior modifications. Nothing that had actually changed in his home. His frustration boiled over, and he couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "This is a joke, right?" he sneered. "You people are seriously still trying this?" Tom looked uncomfortable, but tried to stand his ground. "These fines are mandatory, Mr. Parker." John shook his head, his anger rising. "No, they're not, because I'm not part of your HOA. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words left no room for argument. Tom opened his mouth, but John cut him off. "I've already checked. There's nothing in my deed that says I'm part of your so-called association. You know that, right?" Tom hesitated for a moment, clearly unsettled. We know it's been annexed. Your property is now under HOA jurisdiction." John took a step forward, his voice dropping low. "No, your little board doesn't have any jurisdiction over my property. It's a scam. And if you send me one more fake violation, I'll be suing you all for harassment and fraud. Do you understand?" The color drained from Tom's face. He glanced down at the ground, his eyes darting nervously. I'll need to speak to the board," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Without waiting for a reply, John slammed the door in his face. He leaned back against it, trying to steady his breath. This was beyond ridiculous. But as much as he wanted to throw in the towel, he knew he couldn't back down now. Karen and her cronies wouldn't stop unless they were made to. Hours later, as John sat on the porch, trying to push the stress aside, his phone buzzed. A new email flashed on the screen. Homeowners Association property line warning. Immediate action required. His pulse quickened. He opened it, dreading what he would find. It was worse than he could have imagined. The email claimed that the HOA had filed a lien against his house due to unpaid violations. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a blatant attempt to take his property. The word foreclosure was even mentioned in the email. "No," John muttered to himself, his hands shaking in fury. He dialed his real estate attorney immediately. The man listened to his concerns quietly, then responded with calm professionalism. "They can't do that, John," his attorney said after a pause. "I'll look into this. But for now, don't engage with them further. Forward me anything they send you." John felt a small sense of relief, but knew the fight wasn't over. Karen had been playing a dangerous game, and now, even from behind bars, she had orchestrated this entire thing. The next morning, as John was getting ready for work, a faint noise caught his attention. He looked out of the window and froze. A figure in dark clothing was standing by the back door, fiddling with the handle. His stomach dropped, and instinct kicked in. "No," he muttered, grabbing his phone. He didn't rush outside to confront them. Instead, he carefully slid his phone out of his pocket, holding it low so the camera could record the figure without being seen. He zoomed in, his heart pounding as the faint light revealed the intruder's face. It was Tom, the same man who had delivered the fraudulent fines. John had half a mind to let him break in so the police could catch him in the act. But he didn't need to do that. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and said, "There's an intruder on my property right now. They're trying to break into my house." He stayed silent as the dispatcher took the details and assured him help was on the way. Meanwhile, Tom fumbled with the door, muttering curses under his breath. But his luck had run out. A voice called out from across the street, cutting through the tension. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" John's neighbor, an older man who had been silent up until now, stood on his porch holding a shotgun, not aimed at Tom but clearly visible. "I'd take my hand off that door if I were you," the neighbor called out casually. Tom froze, his face going pale. His hands trembled as he slowly lifted them away from the door handle. The neighbor took a step closer, his voice steady. "Cops are already on their way, buddy." The sirens were almost immediate. Within moments, 2 police cruisers skidded to a halt in front of John's house. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, and Tom knew the jig was up. "Put your hands behind your back," one officer said as Tom stammered in protest. Wait, this isn't what it looks like." Tom tried to explain, but it was too late. As the officer cuffed him, Tom's eyes darted desperately toward John. She made me do it," he muttered. "Karen, she told me to scare you into compliance. I wasn't going to break in, I swear." John stared at him, arms crossed. "Then what was the plan if you got in?" Tom hesitated. "She wanted me to plant something. I don't know exactly, just enough to make sure you didn't keep fighting the HOA." The truth was coming out. John's heart sank as he realized just how far Karen and her cronies had been willing to go. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But now there was no turning back. John had everything he needed to expose them. The officers led Tom away in cuffs, and as John watched, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. This wasn't over, but with the law on his side and the truth finally revealed, John was ready for whatever came next. The fight for his home, for his peace, had only just begun. The following weeks passed with an unsettling quiet. The battle had been long and draining, but John Parker knew the war wasn't over, not yet. Even with Tom behind bars and Karen facing charges, he could feel the storm wasn't done brewing. He had fought for his home, his family, and his peace of mind, but he also knew that Karen wasn't one to let go of power so easily. Then one morning, as John sat with Liam at breakfast, the knock on the door came. He immediately knew this wasn't a casual visit. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air, and despite his earlier victories, there was always that nagging feeling that Karen would try something else. John stood up, motioning for Liam to stay seated. "Stay here, buddy," he said, trying to sound calm, but the tension was palpable. He walked toward the door, his hand tightening on the handle as he prepared for whatever was coming next. Opening the door, he was greeted by a lawyer, someone John had never seen before, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a thick file. Behind him stood a woman who looked familiar, a member of the local HOA board that he had never paid much attention to before. The lawyer wasted no time. "Mr. Parker, I'm here to inform you that we are seeking full restitution for the damages you've caused to the Homeowners Association's reputation and funds," the lawyer said, his tone smooth but laced with barely concealed threat. "We'll be filing a lawsuit unless you immediately comply with our demands." John felt his stomach twist. Was this really happening again? What damages? John said, struggling to keep his voice steady. You tried to illegally annex my property, falsely fined me, and even went so far as to send someone to break into my house. And now you're trying to sue me? The lawyer pushed a thick stack of papers toward him, clearly prepared for this conversation. We have the right to recover our losses. We are well within our legal bounds, Mr. Parker. You're in violation of community regulations. You owe us. John felt the fury bubble to the surface. It was clear they were trying to intimidate him into submission, but he wasn't going to back down. He leaned in, his voice low and firm. I've already told you, your association has no jurisdiction over my property. If you try this again, I will sue for harassment and fraud. The lawyer blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by the sheer confidence in John's voice. You'll regret this, the lawyer muttered before turning and walking off, clearly unable to get the upper hand. As the door shut behind him, John exhaled in relief. He glanced at Liam, who was watching from the kitchen table. Don't worry, buddy, John said, his voice more reassuring now. This won't be the last fight, but we're in control now. I'm going to make sure we never have to deal with them again. Days later, Karen's trial began. Her lawyer had tried to argue that she was acting under stress and in the best interests of the community. But it was clear to everyone present that this was a farce. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witnesses, Tom's confession, and the fraudulent fines. All of it was enough to shut down her scheme once and for all. When the judge handed down the verdict, Karen's face contorted in disbelief. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison for assaulting a minor, conspiracy to commit trespassing, and orchestrating a fraudulent HOA scam. As the guards took her away, she turned to glare at John. You ruined everything, she spat, her voice filled with venom. John smiled back, not out of malice, but out of pure satisfaction. No, Karen, you did this to yourself. But the victory didn't end there. As Karen was escorted from the courtroom, the ripple effect of her actions began to unfold. Other homeowners, some of whom had suffered at the hands of Karen's twisted HOA, began to file lawsuits. In a matter of months, the fraudulent HOA board was completely dissolved. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the collapse of the so-called community that Karen had built. Tom, desperate to save himself, turned on the remaining members of the board, revealing the years of fraudulent activity that had been hidden behind closed doors. John, with the help of the legal system, had not only protected his home, but also brought an end to a deeply corrupt system that had harmed many others. Finally, John could relax. His home was free from any HOA jurisdiction, and as he sat on his porch watching Liam play in the yard, he realized that he had won against the HOA, against Karen, and against anyone who thought they could control him. His neighbor, the older man who had stepped in when Tom tried to break in, walked by. You were right, John, he said with a knowing smile. They won't stop unless you end it for good. John nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in months. Some people think power means they can do whatever they want, he said, his voice steady. But the only way to stop them is to remind them that they can't. And for the first time since moving in, John felt like he truly belonged. His family, his home, and his peace were his once again. What would you have done if you were in John's shoes? Do you think justice can prevail in the face of overwhelming power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We value your perspective, and your voice matters. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of justice and triumph. Stay tuned for future stories that inspire and empower, and join the conversation today.